Apocrypha. And I noted that Catholics like to claim that Luther removed the Apocrypha from the Old Testament. But actually, many of you listening probably know Luther did not remove the Apocrypha from his translation of the Bible. He included it, and he included it with this caveat. He said, these books are not held equal to the scriptures, but are useful and good to read. Yet Catholics like to claim that Luther actually, in the beginning of his career, accepted the Apocrypha, but then he was forced to abandon the Apocrypha. And as the argument goes, as I interacted with a more well-known Catholic apologist over this, he pointed out to me that Luther was in debate with John Eck, and they were talking about purgatory. And Luther pointed out that there were no scriptural proof texts for purgatory in the Bible. And then Eck brought up 2 Maccabees 12:46, which talks about prayers for the dead, thus kind of a roundabout proof text for purgatory. And this Catholic apologist told me that because Eck had cornered Luther, Luther was forced to deny the canonicity of the Apocrypha. Well, there's a couple things to keep in mind here. Number one, in this debate with Eck, Luther still actually believed in purgatory. Secondly, why did Luther deny the entirety of the Apocrypha? Why not just 2 Maccabees? And thirdly, and I think this is the major point, is I don't think Luther ever accepted the canonicity of the Apocrypha because of his training as a monk was in a tradition that never accepted them. I'm sure some people know that there were other people during the Reformation period that had the same view that Luther did on the canonicity of the Apocrypha. For instance, Erasmus of Rotterdam and Cajetan, Cardinal Cajetan, also, they did not think the Apocrypha was in the canon of sacred scripture. One bit of evidence that I really wonder why more people don't cite out there in their cyber battles is that even at the Council of Trent, Trent was the council that dogmatically determined which books were supposed to be in the canon. Well, there were a group of scholars, Catholic scholars, at the Council of Trent that were actually arguing against including the Apocrypha in the canon of Scripture. So the reason why, it's not like they were listening to Luther and decided to get rid of the Apocrypha. It's because they were part of this same tradition that believed that the Apocrypha was not in the canon of sacred Scripture. The Catholic apologists won't tell you that during the Reformation period, there were two traditions within the church on the inclusion and exclusion of the Apocrypha, and that Trent chose one over the other. Well, we get into the New Testament, and unfortunately, time doesn't allow to go through all the quotes that Catholics use to prove that Luther denigrated the New Testament. It's another very complicated subject. I'll only bring up the most popular New Testament quote that's used against Luther. Luther is purported to have said, St. James' epistle is really an epistle of straw, for it has nothing of the nature of the gospel about it. And in fact, as my PowerPoint points out, some Catholics don't even realize that Luther actually translated the Epistle of James into German and included it in his translation of the Bible. Now, one thing I've noticed over the years is that when Catholics do bring up this comment from Luther, it's a selective citation because Catholics leave out something really important, that when Luther made this comment, he made it as a comparison statement. He was saying that the Epistle of James is really an epistle of straw compared to, say, a New Testament book like the Gospel of John. And when you think about what Luther was saying, it's not as far-fetched as you might think, because say you were to meet somebody that's not a Christian and they wanted to read the Bible, what book are you going to send them to get an understanding of the life, death, resurrection of Jesus Christ? Are you going to send them to the book of James? No, you're going to send them to the Gospel of John. So Luther was really, even if I don't agree with his theory of canonicity completely, I think he has a valid point that certain books in the New Testament are going to tell you far more about Jesus Christ, why he lived and why he died, more than other books will. Also, Catholics tend to leave out the fact that in Luther's prefaces, he also says that James is a good book because it sets up no doctrine of men, but vigorously promulgates the law of God. And we'll get into the law of God in a minute. But Luther also goes on to say, I would not thereby prevent anyone from including or extolling him as he pleases, for there are otherwise many good sayings in him. In fact, I have in parentheses, Luther also positively cited James throughout his career and even preached a sermon from the book of James. Now, what was really fascinating to me when I first started looking at this quote, and Catholic apologists at the time in the early 2000s weren't talking about this, but this epistle of straw comment only appears in the original 1522 preface to Luther's New Testament. After 1522, all the editions of Luther's Bible dropped the epistle of straw comment, along with the entire paragraph that was placing these value judgments on particular New Testament books, James, Jude, Hebrews, and Revelation. The question is, why did Luther retract the comment? Why did he do this? Was he embarrassed? I know in today's world, people go on X or Twitter or whatever it's called. They go on Facebook, they make statements. They're called out for those statements or embarrassed about those statements, so they remove them. Is that what was going on with Luther? I really don't think so. I think what was going on here is that when Luther released his New Testament and he released these prefaces that went along with it to explain the books of the Bible, I think he removed it because he didn't want to cause any confusion among those people that were actually getting to read the German Bible, some for the very first time. And notice that above here, and one of my points, Luther says, I would not thereby prevent anyone from including or extolling him as he pleases. So I know Catholics like to bring this comment from Luther up a lot about the book of James, but what I've found very interesting is that when I survey the literature from the 16th century written by Catholic polemicists that were writing against Luther, they may mention this occasionally, but this was not one of the major issues they were fixated on. It seems today many Catholic apologists are fixated on this question. So I think Luther really removed it just because he had a pastoral heart. He didn't want to confuse the people that were reading his German New Testament, and he wanted them to experience the New Testament without being burdened by his very minor textual criticism.